Tania Suarez, thank you very much for being a guest today on the Fluent English Pro podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Thank you. All right, Tania, your presence here today is essential because you merge two very important aspects of professional growth when it comes to non-native English speakers. One is leadership, and the other one is empowering your leadership through speaking in a second or foreign language. Would you
Mhm.
please tell us a little bit more about what you do and how you got to this point, like to cover this type of area or to help professionals in this type of way?
Absolutely. So, I'm a leadership communication coach and I work with executives who are non native speakers from all over the world. And the way that I got here, my background is in communication. So, I started with public relations and then I got into education, English as a second language, and then combining both passions and being able to talk about business. I realized that by helping executives, the trickle down effect of that is so powerful and the barrier to entry to those levels. So by the time somebody gets there, there isn't a lot of training for that specific need. And I really wanted to be that bridge so that they could not only excel for themselves, but make the impact that I know that they need and the company needs.
Great, 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 great. Yeah, I'm really happy that you focus on leadership because um, a lot of people think of English just as a tool for execution or for like asking or like a transactional information. But in this case, we are speaking about like using that to lead teams. Yeah. And to be able to be the face and the head of a team or a company. So that's amazing. And that's a
Yeah.
good segue to my first question, which is there is something you mentioned off record, which is like lead with your voice. Yeah,
Mhm.
which is different from having perfect English. Yeah, so like you can be a leader, you can use your English communication skills, the English language to lead. It doesn't mean that it has to be perfect. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes. So a big insecurity that a lot of my clients have and a lot of my followers have are, will they take me seriously in this leadership position if my English isn't perfect? Or that fear of judgment of whether it's, do they feel my expertise is good enough? If my English isn't good enough, there's so much at play there. But the really important thing is, unless you're being hired to be an English professor, that's not their expectation of you. And what I see happen is the leadership skills that they worked a lifetime to get lost in translation. In the process of trying to have perfect English, they lose the leadership impact. They lose some of the ability to have empathy and active listening because the focus is so much on perfectionism. And so to be able to access your voice and realize your voice is your expertise, is your ability to care and to problem solve. And that can be done with pretty simple English. And in fact, especially with American English and American business style, simplicity is the preferred method. I often tell non-native speakers, your English is better and in fact more formal than a lot of native speakers. And so it's okay to simplify and it's actually going to make you sound more natural.
That's great. That's great. I think a similar like just a side note, a similar situation happens with French. Like I've heard like that French speakers in Africa, like the African
Mhm.
countries that have French as their official language, have more elaborate and more polished French than those people living in France. So that's something that happens, and even as a non-native speaker, sometimes because we learn the rules, and I'm sure you have been there. I've been an English teacher before. I have had at school. I used to teach at a higher school, and like my native student
Mhm.
who was from London had terrible grades because her grammar was awful, even though she was a native. So yeah, like being a native speaker doesn't mean you have full command of the language. As
Exactly.
as as contradictory as it sounds, that's
Yeah.
something that is real. Um, Tell us a little bit about how or why having a perfect level of English is not really something that's gonna make you visible or is gonna guarantee that you have the ability to lead. Yeah, how do the how what like where's the balance? Because I'm sure you have to be somewhat fluent uh,
Yes.
to lead. So like where do
Mhm.
we strike that balance between fluency and leadership?
So most people that approach me to work with them they do think the initial need is, I need my English to be better. And that to them translates, I need more English, more phrases, more grammar. But the reason, by the point you have a leadership position in a multinational company and you have spoken English to get to that point, your English is good enough. Of course, do we all love more words and do we want to refine? And especially for non native speakers and high performers and executives, you always want to get better. But I always help them, and I encourage everyone listening to really go through a big mindset shift of improve or work on improving your communication skills, because communication and leadership, they don't always translate. You might be able to express that same thought word for word or the general meaning, but culturally speaking, that might not be the best approach. And so you really need to understand, what is the cultural impact of my leadership? Because, for example, if you're from Latin America, you're probably used to communicating in a more, I always say, like, Latin Americans take you through the journey and then present the destination. And that's appropriate in that business context. But when you're presenting to Americans in corporate America, or where American English is the norm or the accepted communication style, that's not going to be perceived as confident. That's going to be perceived with a little bit of doubt, like, get to the point. Why are you taking so long? And so there you have to adapt your communication. It's not just translate, it's adapting, get to the point first, and then you have to learn how to give that context in a way that excels your executive presence, helps them appreciate your expertise instead of getting lost in that communication style.
Mhm. I experienced that culture shock. I am Latin
Yeah.
American, and when I started working with clients from the States in Canada, like, you say hello and go straight to the point. Like, we Latin
Yes, it's
Americans,
such
we
a
say,
shock.
yeah, yeah, like we warm up the conversation. We go like, hey, how are you
Mhm.
doing? How's everything? How's your company? Blah, blah, blah. Like we do like that social part first, like it's like
Mhm.
5, 10 minutes. Then we speak about the thing. In like American settings, you say hello, you go straight into the thing. Like there is no social warming up like at all.
Exactly. And so what happens there is you have the culture shock, which already you're going into the situation with some insecurity. And then you have that culture shock. And if you haven't prepared for that, you freeze. You're so caught up in your thoughts that you can't listen actively. Like, it really impacts the communication domino effect. And so, a big part there, well, and like what you mentioned about not having time to warm up, it's interesting because it's the way Americans warm up is a little bit differently. And what I tell my clients is, it's going to feel awkward, but in the same way that you give context and you warm up, that earns trust. So what we want to translate is how to earn trust, not necessarily the style. And so to earn trust, and when you feel it that way, then it feels more authentic. Because the worst thing is when you're speaking English as a second or third language and you don't feel like yourself, and you feel like, I have to give up my essence to thrive in this sector. And so what I tell them is, no, your essence is earning trust. Going back to like your voice versus your English. And so how do we earn trust in this setting? And here you have to prove your expertise, get to the point first, have strategic small talk, and then you build with the warmth and the deeper conversation. So once you accept that you're still earning trust and being authentic to yourself, you're just adapting the style to your audience. I find it's a much faster process.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think it takes time. You're gonna make mistakes through that process. I think it's part of it. It's inevitable. But if you get the grasp of it, you will learn that sometimes this. I think it's more effective. It's a lot more effective. I like the American way of doing meetings and calls now because like straightforward.
Because it's
Um,
faster. So you
it
start
is faster.
appreciating
Yeah, yeah,
old
yeah, yeah, yeah.
style.
Yeah. Yeah, but it takes time to adapt. Okay. So the culture aspect is something that we need to take into account. There is another thing, Tania, here, which is fear of my English level not being good enough or not being perceived as good enough to be professional. Um, and sometimes that's not a real thing that is outside of us. It's something that is inside of our like in our head, and that makes us like stop ourselves or prevent ourselves to communicate. How can we manage that fear of judgment, that fear of not having like a professional level of English? How do we tackle that?
That is one of the biggest obstacles to true fluency, because fluency in the real world is different than fluency in the academic shape, where that's passing a test and getting a score. And so when I talk about fluency, I really focus on, can you handle the scenarios that you're in? Can you navigate those? Can you make mistakes with grace? Because that's a big thing. And that's going to tie into how to be able to have that insecurity. In addition to breathing techniques, which are wonderful, understanding and really appreciating, okay, my English is good enough. One of the biggest things, because we can say that, but we all know that if you're talking to a perfectionist, a high performer, an executive, you're like, mm-mm. Like I want to be better. So that doesn't always make that breakthrough that I want for my students. And so a big thing I tell them is you need to learn how to make mistakes with grace and humor. And that is a big transformation, because the fear of, will I be judged when I make a mistake, if I make a mistake? And I always say, we don't say if, it's when. I make mistakes all the time and I'm a native speaker. So if we take away the if, that's already one insecurity down. Like, okay, I'm going to make a mistake at some point. We don't like to hear it, but if you accept it, then we can really strategize. So once we accept that, you strategize, okay, when I make a mistake, how can I recover quickly? How can I not kill the vibe that I've built? How can I maybe use some humor if that's authentic to your personality? I always make the comparison of dancing. When you're dancing, if you make a mistake, if you do a misstep, you don't just like sit on the floor. You're like, I'm done. I'm not going to finish this dance. No, you just kind of stumble for a little bit and you regain composure and you keep going. And so I like to treat fluency and business communication in the same way. You assume, you know, you understand that it's going to happen. So then you can practice. Those are different phrases to practice. Once you know I'm going to make a mistake, then you can think, okay, I typically struggle with certain words that I know are high frequency words I'm going to use in that meeting. So what can I say or do if I think I mispronounced it? Then you practice the phrase. So then you have true coping mechanisms and you study the right things to get you through that moment. And then when you can make mistakes with grace, that's leadership. Leaders aren't afraid to make mistakes. They make them with grace. I love inserting a little bit of humor. If the person likes to play with sarcasm, we play around with personality specific techniques. But that's the kind of executive presence that really thrives. If you think of any leaders who have powerful executive presence, none of them are perfect. They're usually very personable, very relatable. They there's that thing, and that's never perfect robotic English.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, I've learned that myself, like integrating mistakes as part of the whole scenario. Like there is no way those are not going to happen. They are going to happen, whether you like it or not. And for a person who is learning English or improving their English, I think it's a very important aspect of it.
Yeah, so that you don't lose yourself, because I'm sure everybody listening has had that moment where you think you're on a roll or you're making a good connection, but then you make a mistake and you get so consumed by the shame and the moment that that conversation is just, and the thing is, the other person may or may not have noticed the mistake, but they're probably really invested in your story. So then I always think like you deprive them of that moment with you because you just like fell into yourself and you don't know how to get back out of one little bump in the road.
This connects very well with the next question, which is accent. For some reason, and maybe this is something I don't know, maybe even English institutes have planted in people's brains, like they have to sound native, they have to have a native accent. That's not going to happen most of the times unless you have been raised with English as a second language. But if you learn it after in life, then you're going to have an accent. And that's okay. But some people overthink that. Like, oh, I have an accent. They're going to find out I'm not from here, blah, blah, blah. And I think that's part of your identity. Like you have to integrate that and show that not as something that is um, like a negative thing, but something
Yeah.
that portrays who you are and helps you connect with other human beings as well. Could you share your perspective on the role of accent in this case?
Absolutely. So I agree with you that from the language marketing perspective, that's a big point of speak like a native speaker. And in fact, every person I've worked with has mentioned, well, not every person, maybe like 90% have mentioned that that's their goal, to speak like a native speaker. And in the same way that people think fluency means knowing all of English. I try to help them redefine what speaking like a native speaker means. And it doesn't mean having perfect English. The only people that really need perfect native like speaking that I've worked with are actors when they need a specific regional accent, or voiceover artists whose profession has to do with dialect and things like that. Outside of that, which I predominantly work with finance and fintech and tech, it's really about clarity. It's about being understood. And the desire, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, like exploring other languages. The way that we say we want to speak like a native speaker, what that is, in my opinion, and how I perceive it for myself and for the people I work with, is you want to feel comfortable speaking in any situation. You want to be able to be yourself. And that's very different than having perfect English. Because I've had clients that I've worked with who have, if you give them a test, highest score in terms of the nuance of the pronunciation, perfect. But they're so robotic. There's no personality. And I'm like, you know what? That's not fluency. That's not you being fluent. And so interjecting that personality. And so once you understand, and look, I get it, because as much as we want to say accent doesn't matter, it doesn't take away from some negative experiences you may have had. I've experienced them. A lot of my clients have. And when you have those experiences, accent bias is a real thing. When we talk to, working in tech with investors, who they decide to invest with, like VCs and all of these different components, I don't want to take away from someone else's negative experience. But there, I really ask you to pause and think, okay, what can I learn from this? And what do I need to let go? Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to change society, but if I could, I would. But understanding you can only do so much to please others. So, what can you do for yourself and your goal? And so, there I ask, what I always start with is, what are your high frequency words? What are the words that you use, not all the dictionary, that you have to use every day with your work? And let's identify which ones does the accent hurt the clarity? Which ones it make people say, huh? Because it's not all of your English. Sometimes it's just one word, especially if they have like a lot of R's or L's, depending on what your language is. So by identifying those, and then you realize, oh, it wasn't my accent that was causing people to be confused. They just couldn't understand that one word that comes up every 5 seconds. And so when we have a more targeted approach, you gain confidence that your accent was not the issue. It really was certain words that needed a little bit more of pronunciation attention.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Not focusing on your English level as a whole, because that's not the issue. It's just like very particular aspects that need your attention. You can work on them. Don't get overwhelmed. Just like focus on those, and try to find a way to like go over them step by step. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen overnight.
Absolutely. And I always tell people, even as a native speaker, sure, I'm fluent and I can speak English natively. But if you ask me to go do a public speech about biomedical engineering, I don't have the English for that. And so it's remembering that that limitations are not bad. It just helps you understand where to focus.
Hmm. Great, great. Okay, so we just spoke about what doesn't affect your connection with people. We just mentioned
Mhm.
your English level doesn't affect your connection. Your accent doesn't affect your connection. Yeah.
Mhm.
Now, in a positive way, what does influence or what does enhance your connection with people? How can I use my English communication skills to sound more confident, to sound more authoritative, could be, or more persuasive when I'm working with teams?
Oh, this is such a good question. It's such a good question because it involves something that I find is really hard for non-native speakers, and that's active listening. So many people at this high level of English, you're so focused on the output and you forget the input. And part of that is you have to be present. But that's really hard when in your mind you're trying to get what people are saying, but you're also planning what you want to say next. And that is such a distraction. Or you have high anxiety, your heart rate is increasing. You're really like, you're starting to, you have the physical manifestation of anxiety. So many things are happening that take you away from the moment. And what happens is your face, maybe they're telling a funny story and your face looks like, someone's chasing you, that's going to take away from that connection. And so to remember that to be personable is so much better than to be perfect. And so, what does personable mean? And that means listening, it means reacting so that you're able to have those reactions on time. Because sometimes, if you're so caught up in yourself, you might laugh like 2 minutes later because you finally allowed yourself to have that moment. And then it's just awkward. So, there, it's about leaning into curiosity. I always tell people don't think about what you're going to say. I want you to think about what you want to listen to. And so be curious about a person. And what that translates to from a language perspective is listening actively and asking follow up questions. And that changes the English that you choose. Because a lot of times people go into conversations and like, I need to practice what I'm going to say. What am I going to contribute? That ends up, I understand, but it ends up being so stiff and it ends up being so unnatural that you're not going to make that connection. And so really leaning into, okay, who am I? What am I interested in? And most people are interested in other people. And so lean in. And I always tell people if you don't love sports, don't ask a million follow-up questions about sports. You know, you can navigate and find the thing that you have in common or that you think is interesting, even if you don't know how to do it. And that's going to be such a special energy and such a special thing to walk away from a business perspective. Those are the connections that then get you the deals, the promotions, the business relationship. The people who you might bond over, it might seem silly, but those 5 minutes before a meeting, if you bond over both of your love of dogs, you're going to feel so much more relaxed. They're going to know they have that in common. When you're in the meeting, you're presenting or you're pitching, that's going to feel a lot more natural because now it's conversational. You also have something to follow up on. If you see the dog that they mentioned, that's a really natural like text or email, like, hey, I saw this dog. Like, don't you love da da da? That's going to be a lot better than following up with an ask. And so you're building those relationships that are more long term, they're more authentic, and then you get to know people in a way that is so I find it's so rewarding because we don't all have everything in common. You know, a lot of us have really different politics, but you have to work with that person. So when you find the commonality, it sets the stage for you to feel more relaxed, which means you get to access your English faster, which means you're going to feel more fluent, which means you're going to have more positive confidence building situations. And that's going to help you with decreasing anxiety and having really pleasant experiences.
Hey there, if you're enjoying the podcast, imagine how much more progress you could make with consistent, specialized support every week. Introducing the Fluent English Pro membership, designed specifically for busy professionals like you who want to keep improving their English even on a busy schedule. You'll find fluency activities, tutorials, mini courses, vocabulary builders, and live events, all focused on work and business English. Whether it's mastering international meetings, doing presentations, or answering tricky emails, this space is built to help you grow. If you're serious about your communication skills, visit fluentenglishpro.com/members and subscribe today. That is fluentenglishpro.com/members. Let's turn your English into your biggest professional asset. I would like to highlight here because like then a person who likes to overthink, such as myself, will be like, hey, I gotta do this, but I gotta do it now. I gotta relax, but immediately. And then they're gonna build up all like this frustration and anxiety. This is something you have to practice and gradually improve through practice, little by little, step by step. It's not gonna happen after a week. You gotta allow yourself to make mistakes, and you gotta allow yourself time to grow in that skill.
Yes. And it's about experimenting and building those skills in low pressure situations. So, a big part of my work, because it's a lot about confidence building and dealing with those insecurities, is breath work. However, if you're trying to monitor your breathing during a big meeting and you're trying to monitor your body posture and you're trying to, like, it's too many things to focus on. So, I always tell people any technique that you learn to build confidence and to help yourself relax. Look, have you ever been in an argument with someone and said, calm down? That has never worked. So you telling yourself to calm down when you're in a high anxiety moment is not going to work. Saying to yourself, relax, that just makes it worse. So what you need to do is practice in low pressure situations. So if you're trying to work on your small talk, go to the grocery store and try out some of those phrases with someone that you're probably never going to see again. If you're working on breathing, first start working on your breathing awareness when you're watching a show. Then, when you're having casual conversations, even in your native language with your spouse or your family, observe your breathing. That awareness then becomes automatic. So then when you do it in high pressure situations, it's not taking away from your energy, but you're able to bring it back. And so that's the number one thing. Don't try things in high pressure moments. Practice in low pressure and practice a lot. Be okay with mistakes because mistakes just help you learn. But I find that as much as we say be okay with make mistakes, like we all have egos. We all have, it's also really hard when you're such a high level professional in your native language and you know how smart you are and you know how capable you are and you're making these basic mistakes in English. It is a huge ego blow. And so a big thing for me is being realistic. It's like, okay, this is a reality. So let's find safe spaces where you can make those mistakes, not feel crushed, and build your confidence. And so that can be, like I said, the grocery store, it can be speaking groups. I always recommend walking or hiking groups because when you're moving, if you make a mistake, just move over to a different person. Like it's just, it facilitates getting over yourself. And I mean that in a positive way in order to get through to others.
That's great. Yeah, I like the idea of looking for low pressure spaces or like open space situations where like if something happens, like it's actually part of the situation not to understand each other because there's gonna be some noise or there's gonna be some distance. There's movement, so you have to repeat yourself. So you can like get used to repeating or to asking for clarification. I like that idea.
It's kind of bringing it back to dancing. If I'm going to try a new dance, I'm not going to go on stage in the middle of a football game to try to work it out for the first time. No, you have to practice on your own with a mirror, with a partner, and then you work up to those bigger scenarios. But so many people at this level feel they have to do everything all at once in the moment, in the worst moment possible to do it, and then they feel crushed.
That's a great segue to my next question because sometimes we think being fluent and being confident means speaking all the time nonstop and not having like pauses or silences. And that's not true. Like and that's something for a person who has anxiety whenever they're speaking in public or speaking in a second or foreign language, that freaks them out. Like, oh, I ran out of things to say. I forgot my next idea. I lost my train of thought. And then there is a pause. They freak out and they think, okay, this is like people are going to judge me. Tell us a little bit of why actually pauses are important. Like, they are not your enemy, they are your friend, and they are part of communication.
Absolutely. I think a big part of that discrepancy or misunderstanding is that when we're first training English, and even for native speakers in school, they're always trying to get you to stop using filler words. And and I get it. At that stage, most people are overusing it. But then I find that that gets ingrained, almost overly ingrained. And so you start demonizing those pauses or filler words and you stop using them. And then it creates that awkwardness that you mentioned of now I don't know what to talk about. And as often happens, you lose your train of thought, either because you're anxious, you're worried, you're planning what you want to say and it got overplanned, or it didn't translate, or you're human and you got distracted because a bird flew by. Who knows? It's not always language based. So, a big thing there is to be able to have pauses in a way that's interesting and to prepare for the moments where you lose your train of thought. Again, this is where I mentioned targeted practice. Find one or two phrases that you can use during those moments because sometimes we know how to say it in our native language, but then in English, you're like, it seems like such a simple thing, but it's very nuanced. And so it might just be a few words, but you have to practice it. So they're like, oh, I forgot what I was talking about, or my mind went blank. So you pick the phrase that you like, that feels the most natural, practice it, and practice it smiling because it's really different. Oh, I, I I don't know what I was saying. And you just like get so anxious it makes the other person anxious instead of just being cool and like, huh, you know what? I totally forgot what I was saying. What do you want to talk about now? That's a very different connection. It also makes people feel you're very confident. That's the magic. If you make mistakes with grace, people are going to think you're even more confident than if you're perfect all the time. And then with the pauses, it's really about being strategic with the pauses. What happens with non native speakers is often you think that speaking faster makes you sound more fluent.
Yeah,
And
thank you
with
for addressing that pacing. Thank you, thank you. Yeah, sorry for
yes.
interrupting. Go ahead. Pacing, pacing. Yep.
No, but it's a and I understand why. But what I once you get down to the actual linguistics of it, it's really about connected speech and other speaking patterns. They're eating pauses elsewhere. But because that translates to most people's minds is like, oh, if I speak faster, I'll sound more fluent. But what happens is you open your mouth less, which means less clarity, which means people are going to think you're going to think that they don't understand your English, but really what they don't understand is anything you're saying because you're not moving your mouth. The other thing is the rhythm of English pausing is different than, for example, Spanish or Portuguese. Like English doesn't speak in sentences, we speak in chunks, which typically tends to be like every 3 to 5 words. And so understanding intonation rhythm helps you figure out where to pause more naturally. The other thing is, I find, especially in Latin American countries, because that's where my family's from, the rhythm of conversation is so different. I don't know if you've ever noticed it when you have a bunch of Latinos together, everyone's talking over each other and everyone's kind of, it feels like everyone's talking at the same time and getting louder.
we we are loud. We are
We
loud.
are allowed, but part of it, the cultural part of it is it's acceptable to jump in. And in fact, if you don't jump in, you're not going to be heard. Whereas the English acceptable conversation style is you only jump in when someone else pauses or when it's your turn. And so when you have that background of, I just need to talk or I'm not going to get heard, that also increases the likelihood that you're going to demonize pausing. So when you think, okay, what's my goal? This is back to like redefining how you perceive everything. My goal is to have a conversation. Okay, my pausing and my eye contact, that helps other people feel that they can participate. That's authentic to me. So let me work on that. And so they're sometimes taking a breath, studying intonation patterns, saying well instead of Like I always say, okay, and they get kind of tiring, especially if you overuse them. So sometimes, well, even just like right now, right? You're just the hand on the chin, the breath. It feels intentional instead of just you mm, trying to like see how the energy was completely like, gone at that moment. But if you're just like, well, let me think about it. I'm not sure. So those pauses feel a lot more natural and they keep the flow going. So I always recommend I usually like, well, let me think about it. That's a great question. Those are really simple that you can practice, but you want to practice how it feels. And the other thing I recommend is practice transition phrases so that you can jump to other topics. A lot of non-native speakers feel they get stuck on a conversation because you don't know how to respectfully get out of it. But jumping around topics is part of what that connection is. So phrases like the one that Americans use the most, in my opinion, which I counted one night, what my friends and I were together, speaking of. So if someone's like, oh, I'm going on vacation. Oh, speaking of travel, did you hear that so and so went to Hawaii? Like, oh, speaking of summer, until you just keep jumping on topics. But if you have those phrases like speaking of or that reminds me of, you can confidently change the subject instead of awkwardly pausing and you're like, I don't know what else to talk about. It's because you don't feel confident changing. So there's so many factors there, but those are going to help you accept that pausing is not bad. It can be really quite strategic and make you sound more natural.
Hmm. Great. I love the fact that you introduced the subject of pacing and speed together with silence, because there is so much more to communication and language than like the words. There's also what we will technically call it paralinguistics, but that's like a nerdy
Hmm.
word, like the body language and other elements that add up to the communication.
Yeah.
Um, so really appreciate that you brought that up. Um, so I have a final question to wrap up, which is we've covered like aspects of integrating mistakes, integrating your accent, integrating who you are. For some people, this might be tricky to do because maybe that has been like ingrained in their brain for so long, and that's the way they have been trained, or maybe that's what has been sold to them in terms of what good English should sound like.
Mhm.
What is one or a couple of mindset shifts that people can start practicing today in order to empower themselves and be able to lead with their voice by using English?
The two biggest mindset shifts I recommend, one is something I say every day to everyone I work with, is accepting that your English is good enough. In fact, the warm up routine that I use at the beginning and end of every session and what I coach my clients to do every day, it's just a three-step routine. And so it's massaging your ears in three spots. So I call it 3, 2, 1. And when you're doing the ears, to say English equals calm confidence. And so what I'm trying to do is reprogram them that anytime they think about English and that it's their turn to speak English, we activate this calm confidence. Also, from a physiological perspective, when you're massaging your ears like that, it creates blood flow, which you can feel. So if you're anxious and thinking about a million different things, it brings you back into the sensation of the moment. And then for two, you bring your shoulders up and down. And I say, my English is good enough. So English equals calm confidence. My English is good enough. What the shoulders does is typically non-native speakers will tense up here and not realize it. So you associate English with tension, but you don't realize that the physical tension does not necessarily mean emotional or intellectual tension. And so just by doing that, and then you open up your lungs. And the last one is just one breath. And there I'll have everybody do their own whatever they need for the week. Like, I am adaptable. I am excited. I am like whatever goal they have. But that one breath slows your heart rate down. From a cognitive perspective, when your heart rate's accelerated, you go into fight or flight, which the brain then doesn't let you access creativity and language other than the basics because it thinks you are being chased by a lion. So when you train your body to calm down, then like when people say like, "Oh, I freeze. I can't find the word I need." They don't realize it's because they've been holding their breath the whole conversation and their heart rate increases. So that's one way to help because it's easy to tell people like, yeah, just tell yourself English is good enough. Like, no, you also need a process of like, okay, but how? So this is a physical way that you can help yourself believe that.
Yeah. Is how you tell your body, like your mind commands your body to react that way. So you're doing the reverse thing. You're telling your body everything's okay. So
Yeah,
it sends the signal back to the brain or to your mind, and you are aware, or like consciously or unconsciously, that everything is okay and you're gonna be okay.
exactly. We're reverse engineering
Uh
confidence because
huh.
it's the only way I have found. 'Cause I've experimented with so many different methods. It's the one way that I found is the most successful because again, I really believe in training in low pressure situations. So if you're doing this every time you're in a session with me or before a meeting, you make it a habit. By the time you're in that high pressure meeting, oftentimes my clients will just think about 3, 2, 1, and just thinking about it activates that physical reaction and they're able to access their calmer self even without the movement. So it's so powerful. So it's the mindset shift and then finding a physical way to help yourself accept it.
Great. That's a great perspective. And now that I think of it, we just went first circle with the topics because a few months ago I interviewed a professional in breath work.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So I'm glad that it all connects. It all connects. Really happy.
Breathing is a big part of fluency and confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Tanya. I think we have covered all of the aspects we wanted to cover today. I'm sure the listeners are going to benefit a lot from what you have shared with us, and they're going to be more confident and more open to improve not their English level, but how they perceive themselves in a kind way. Yeah, and integrate
Yes.
who they are, how they communicate, the mistakes which are a part of communication, silences, and all that. So really appreciate that human approach you have, and that compassionate approach you have
Thank you.
to communication. I'm sure people want to learn more, and I know you have a lot out there to share with listeners because you're on YouTube, you have a podcast, you have a website. So if
Mhm.
people want to continue learning about how they can lead with their voice when speaking in English as a foreign or second language, where can we find you?
Thank you so much. I would love anybody who wants more tips about confidence and leadership English. I have a podcast called just that, Leadership English. I'm also Ask Tanya on Instagram and TikTok. And I also have a YouTube channel and my website, taniasuarez.com.
So, for those listening, the links to Tania's social media channels, to her podcast, and her website are going to be in the episode description. Go right now, click those links, follow her on social, subscribe to her podcast, subscribe to her YouTube channel, and you're going to benefit a lot. I'm loving the titles I see here. So, I'm sure as a listener, you will absolutely benefit from all this content.
Thank you.
Tania, it has been live. It has been lovely to have you here today. Thank you so much. Really appreciate all your knowledge.
Thank you.